The Tourist from Shin'en is back once again. This is a game that I greatly enjoyed both on Nintendo Switch and of course on the new Xbox console. But now it has returned on PlayStation consoles as well, releasing for PS4 and PS5. But this release marks a rather momentous occasion, if you will, because it is in fact the very first console game to render at native 8K at 60 frames per second. And to discuss this rather curious anomaly, I've brought along the one and only Richard Leadbetter.
Hello there, John. So, this is actually quite fascinating, really, from, I guess two perspectives. First of all, in theory, the PlayStation 5 can output 8K, right? It's there on the box. But there's no actual support for it in the firmware at the moment. So, you can't, basically. But the Touryst is rendering internally at native 8K, but it's using it basically for super sampling anti-aliasing, right?
Yes, that's correct. So it's the idea here is to give you the best possible image quality by essentially rendering it at a much higher resolution and then sampling it down to 4K output. But internally, it is doing the full 7680 by 4320 resolution. I talked to Shin'en about this actually, and he stressed no tricks, no reprojection. It's just full-on 8K. So
awesome.
I guess the big question then I had at least is, all right, so how did they actually get to 8K 60 and how does it look? Because, fundamentally, this is a Switch game to begin with, right? And it goes for a very specific kind of art style, which is actually well suited to rendering at high resolutions. So this isn't really like some kind of crazy demanding thing, but it's a beautiful game, I think, just an awesome style. But I asked Shin'en about this, and fundamentally, this kind of gets to the center of the difference between, say, the PlayStation 5 and the Xbox Series X. And we'll talk more about those differences shortly, but they are very similar machines, right? Mm-hmm. PlayStation 5 has fewer CUs, and it has fewer teraflops.
Right.
But it is clocked at a higher rate, and the memory configuration is different.
Right.
So essentially, what they're saying here is that it's pretty much specifically two things. The higher clock speed of PlayStation 5 allowed them to hit native 8K, and beyond this, rather than just say porting the PS4 version, it was rewritten using the native PS5 graphics API. So I'm curious, Rich, what you make of this then, considering the difference between the machines.
I think we need to stress that the Xbox Series X version does also super sample down to 4K, but it does so from 6K, not 8K.
Yep.
And I guess we'll talk about that in a moment. But yeah, I mean, I guess fundamentally there are going to be aspects of development that do benefit from the entire GPU running at a higher clock as opposed to working in parallel over more compute units. And we've not actually seen a scenario like this before. And maybe it is down to the specific properties of this particular renderer. But it's fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think that's what's interesting is these guys come from sort of a German demo scene background almost, though they've been making games for especially Nintendo systems for a very long time. Their history kind of lies in pushing hardware in interesting ways and delivering their own completely in-house technology and doing it very, very fast, right? So it was already incredible to see a sort of a 6K internal on Xbox Series X, and then we just have a slight boost here. But fundamentally, this is more just about the feat of doing it more than anything else, right?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, the thing is, we don't yet have that firmware support for 8K. So even if you've got an 8K screen like I do, you're going to be watching it at 8K downscaled to 4K and then upscaled back again to 8K by the display until that native resolution support in the firmware is there. So
I forgot about that. You have that 8K, that gigantic 8K display. I've not yet seen it, but it sounds immense to say the least.
Yeah, it is kind of bizarre when you run a PC desktop at 500% resolution scaling just to be able to make it work. But that's the other thing. I guess we should probably talk about that a bit later on, the actual viability of 8K for this generation of consoles, because it's It's very, very niche and select. And I think in this case, with the Touryst, it's more about the kind of pristine quality you get from super sample anti-aliasing.
That's exactly right. It has this very like crisp sort of design. There is no sort of heavy post-processing motion blur or anything like that. But that, even when targeting 8K though, there was actually some room to improve the visuals further. For instance, they do use depth of field. That's a huge part of the visual design. That's what gives it this sort of tilt-shifted look, right? Essentially, on PS5, they've gone back and slightly improved their depth of field implementation, and it's most noticeable when looking at the transition from an in-focus object to one that is out of focus. There's a few more visible artifacts in other versions of the game versus the new one, so it's neat to see that they were able to improve that. But actually, I should mention that one thing about the depth of field that's interesting is that when you're running the game super sampled at 8K, the blurring effect is less pronounced, basically. And I think what's happening there is that the depth of field blur basically scales based on output res. So when you're at 8K, we've seen this in plenty of other games. It does look a little different, but either way, it is cleaner. And you can actually disable the 8K by switching off anti-aliasing, essentially, which then drops it down to native 4K. And kind of jokingly suggested that, well, this will save on energy consumption, or help the system run cooler. So which is it's fascinating.
It is fascinating, but I guess it also allows us to see the difference between the super sampling, anti-aliasing, and no anti-aliasing, right? I mean, it's quite a useful mode there just for Digital Foundry, if not for anybody else. I mean, I'd prefer to run SSAA all day long.
Yes, exactly. Me too. But of course, it is, it's fun to see the difference. So I guess the question then is, how does it actually compare in practice to the Xbox version? People probably would like to see. Mm-hmm. And so Xbox has two modes. It has a 4K 120 mode, which the PlayStation 5 also has, and then it has the aforementioned 6K mode. So there are actual visible differences here, and this is what I was really fascinated to see. When you compare them, weirdly enough on Xbox, it still kind of has this somewhat 4K native look. Like, it's not, you know what I mean? It's hard to say exactly what's going on there, but it doesn't have the same appearance for sure. And you can definitely see that the edges are cleaned up here on the PlayStation version just by running it at that higher resolution. And in fact, you can actually change the settings between the different modes on PS5 now, which is cool. Whereas on Xbox, they kind of determine it by your dashboard settings. So if you're set to 120 hertz,
right,
you get 4K 120. If you set it to 4K 60, then you get the higher res 6K mode, basically. Whereas you have to change that within the game menu on PS5, since there is no just like global 120 output mode on that system. So beyond that, though, the shadow cascade resolution was also boosted on PS5 in many areas, which is curious. And this also has an interesting effect so they're using an exponential shadow map system in this game, which isn't something you see that often, to be honest. But the changes they made to make it work well at the high resolution has apparently resulted in subtle differences in shadowed areas. Like if you look here, you can actually see the way the sort of lighting bounces around here, or the way it looks in the scene, is slightly different, almost like a change in the way the light is leaking. I don't know. It's curious. They look mostly the same, but there is this subtle difference when you compare them between the two.
Okay.
There's also, of course, the depth of field thing I mentioned. You can see the comparison here.
And we can talk about performance, but there isn't really much of a story here, which is to say that if you're running it at 60 hertz, you get 60 frames per second. And if you're running it at 120 hertz, you get 120 frames per second. An absolute lock, right?
Yeah, and I actually think that's something really to praise these guys here for. And it's the same on Xbox and PlayStation all the way around. It's just basically perfect, right? It's exactly as it should be. There's no loading pauses, there's no stuttering, the frame rate is flawless. Even when you boot the game for the first time, there's no startup logos here. It just drops you immediately into the game, which is really, really cool, I have to say. And that's something I've always appreciated about the Touryst specifically. So there is that. And of course, I should also mention, this is a cross-buy game, and there is a PlayStation 4 version, so you can play it on PS4 and PS4 Pro. And these versions are kind of expected, actually. They're both very good as well. So on PS4 Pro, it looks kind of like the Xbox One X version, but it uses a more aggressive dynamic resolution scaling system, which means it can hit native 4K in some instances, like indoor areas perhaps, but when you're running around outdoors, it's usually between 1440p and 1512p or so kind of in that range. Whereas on the base PS4, it's pretty much just a completely stable 1080p, though it does seem like DRS can be activated in select circumstances. It's really good on both of these platforms, of course, but fundamentally, I guess, it's still this wild 8K solution is kind of fascinating to us, I think, because as you mentioned earlier, there is currently no way to get an 8K output from PS5, right? It is capped at 4K, but theoretically, well, we know that it should be able to support that mode, and I actually asked them about this as well, and basically it would just take a minor tweak to the game to allow for actual true 8K output from the Touryst, right? So it would work pretty easily if and when Sony actually enables 8K, which I assume is a when. I mean, they put it on the box, so you kind of got to think that at some point that's going to happen, right?
I'd take VRR first, to be honest.
Yeah, likewise, big time.
But 8K support, it's got to be coming, and the fact that it's on the box kind of suggests it has to at some point, surely. That's always been a kind of slightly bizarre. But I think just talking generally about the Touryst, it's quite a simple game, but it's one that I highly recommend checking out. And simply, if you've got an HDMI 2.1 screen of any description, if you want to see 4K locked at 120 frames per second, if you want a presentation that really does look great on a modern flat panel display, this is the game for you. It's awesome on all platforms, and I guess we've moved on to the next level with PS5 here, so I'm just really happy that A, it's available, and B, it's still absolutely pristine.
Absolutely. But as for the 8K rendering itself, I do think it's really important for us to stress that this is just sort of it's a fun curiosity in this game, but nobody should expect this to become the norm by any stretch of the imagination, right? Like this is just, this is something that I've sort of compared to maybe the PlayStation 3 and 360 era, where in select cases it was possible to display a game at 1080p, and I think it is feasible to do that on Xbox Series X and PlayStation 5 as well, but I think it's going to be limited to specific types of games and those that don't necessarily push things too hard. So you're not going to be seeing any sort of Unreal Engine 5 8K games, I'd imagine.
Yeah.
Pushing tech boundaries here. That's just not really feasible. And we know this based on the performance of 8K in the PC graphics card space. So
absolutely. It's just kind of nuts. You need machine learning to actually make that work to a playable degree on most modern titles. I mean, I think we did actually get Forza Horizon 3 running 30 frames per second on a 1080 Ti, which was quite an achievement. But I mean, just to give you an idea of the scale here, 4K 8.3 million pixels, and that is extreme already. When you scale up to 8K, you're not doubling, you're quadrupling. It's like 33.2 million pixels per frame. So just the concept of spending GPU time to service that resolution, it's kind of nuts, but it works with the Touryst because, you know, fundamentally the art style is what it is, and it was originally designed to run at 720p on a Switch. I guess it was 1080p docked. So yeah, but so you're just looking at kind of scaling in line with the capabilities of the new wave of consoles, but you just get that absolute pristine quality, which I just love about this game. And it's not really just the pixel count that's the trick with this one, right? It's just the style and the design and the shading.
Yeah, it's actually something that I find really inspiring. Basically, they built most of their models using Magic of Voxel, which is a very enjoyable program to use. And in fact, this is something I've been experimenting with, as creating models in that and exporting them into Unreal. And there is a lot of potential to do some really cool visual designs. And I think this is one of the first games we've seen that really embraced that specific approach. Obviously, they've converted it to their own mesh format for their specific engine. But it's just a beautiful game. And I love that every single version is awesome. Right? That's what matters here. They did a great job. And I honestly can't wait to see what's coming next from Shin'en, because it has been a little bit since the original release of this game. So I'd assume something cool is in development.
Yeah, but I think beyond this, it's going to be actually really difficult to get anything really viable at 8K from this generation of consoles. Maybe, just maybe, we might see a new Geometry Wars at some point. That would look pretty awesome at 8K and would be viable. But actual applications for this resolution are going to be super limited. And we're already pushing it at 4K, as we have already seen.
Absolutely. But man, Geometry Wars, that would be great. 8K with HDR, give it to me.
Absolutely.
But I think that's going to do it for this video, so thanks for joining me, Rich.
It's been a pleasure.
And if you guys enjoyed this video, as always, be sure to like, subscribe, ring that notification bell, and all that good stuff. And of course, come check us out over on Patreon, where you can get a pristine download of this original video if you want to experience it for yourself without the blemish of YouTube, if you will. But that's all from us for now, so thanks for watching.
Yeah.